I am Milan Aguirre, 32 years old, a sergeant in the United States Army. Here at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, I am fighting the only battle I know I will lose. My 3-year-old daughter, Grace, is dying, and all I can do is hold her hand, listening to the steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. In the middle of it all, my phone vibrated. It was my sister, Vanessa. Her text lit up the screen like a stun grenade tossed into the quiet room. Housewarming party is June 15th. Mom and Dad are flying in. I know you're busy with that thing, but life has to go on. I went numb. The doctors said Grace would be lucky to make it to the middle of June. My sister was planning a celebration on my daughter's barely settled grave. They didn't know that with that one text, they hadn't just abandoned me. They had declared war. Before you hear the rest of my story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below, hit that subscribe button, and get ready for a story about betrayal and the price of underestimating a soldier. The world inside room 418 was a fortress built on routine and silence. At Walter Reed, order was everything. The white sheets on Grace's bed were tucked at perfect 45-degree angles, a discipline I understood deep in my bones. The air smelled of antiseptic and filtered air, a sterile cleanliness that stood in stark contrast to the messy, chaotic grief tearing me apart from the inside. The only sound was the steady, relentless beep of the heart monitor, a metronome counting down the final moments of my daughter's life. Grace's small hand was lost in mine, her skin as fragile as parchment. A web of thin tubes snaked from under her blankets, tethering her to the machines that were now breathing and living for her. Her breaths were shallow, little whispers of air. Earlier, she had stirred, her blue eyes, a faded version of my own, fluttering open. "Mommy," she'd rasped, her voice barely audible. "Can we go to the park tomorrow?" I'd smoothed her blonde hair back from her forehead. "Of course, sweetie, we'll go to the park, and we'll push you on the swings as high as you want." It was a lie. We both knew it. Beside her on the pillow was Sergeant Fluffy, a worn-out stuffed beagle with one floppy ear. He was her constant companion, the stoic soldier who stood guard while she slept. On the bedside table, a plastic tea set and a stack of picture books sat untouched, relics from a life that had been put on hold, a life that would never resume. A few weeks ago, with what little strength she had, she'd asked about her birthday. "For my 4th birthday, can I have a princess party, Mommy? With a bouncy castle?" I'd promised her the biggest bouncy castle anyone had ever seen, my voice steady even as my heart fractured. The party would never happen. She would never turn 4. To fill the suffocating silence, I told her stories, not fairy tales about princesses, but revised histories of my deployments. I turned a grim reconnaissance mission in Afghanistan into a magical exploration of the Whispering Mountains, where my unit and I searched for a hidden crystal cave instead of an enemy outpost. I transformed the harsh, dusty landscape into an enchanted desert filled with friendly talking lizards and rivers of sparkling juice. It was our private world, a sacred space where the horrors of reality couldn't touch us. It was our last line of defense, and it was about to be overrun. My phone vibrated against the metal railing of the bed. The harsh buzz ripped through the quiet of the room. I glanced down, expecting a text from my unit, or maybe from Julia, but it was my sister's name, Vanessa. And then they came, one after another. A barrage, not one message, but 17. Buzz, 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 and ambush. The first was a photo, a sprawling modern house in Phoenix, all glass and white stone, with a turquoise saltwater pool shimmering under the Arizona sun. It was perfect, sterile, and utterly soulless. The next text followed immediately. "What do you think? We finally closed. Housewarming is officially June 15th. You have to be here." My thumb froze over the screen. I couldn't breathe. "Mom and Dad are flying in for it. They're so excited." "I know it's a busy time for you with everything, but this is a really big deal for me, Milan. You can't be this selfish. This is my life's achievement." Each message was a precision strike, hitting me harder than the last. Selfish. She called me selfish for sitting by my dying child's bedside. The words blurred on the screen. The picture of her perfect house with its perfect interior design mocked the scene in front of me. The IV stand, the untouched toys, the small frail body in the bed. Mom and Dad said you need to get out of there. It's not healthy to just sit around. That night, after the evening nurse had checked Grace's vitals and dimmed the lights, I stepped into the hallway and called Vanessa. A part of me, the part that still foolishly clung to the idea of family, thought there had to be a mistake. A misunderstanding. She picked up on the second ring, her voice bright and breathless. "Milan, did you see the pictures? Isn't it gorgeous?" "Vanessa, I got your texts," I started, my voice low. "About the party. It sounds amazing, but I can't come." "What do you mean, you can't come?" Her tone shifted instantly, the warmth evaporating into pure impatience. "The caterers are already booked. I have important people from my company flying in. This is a huge networking opportunity. The logistics are a nightmare to change." Logistics? She was talking about logistics. I closed my eyes, pressing my fingers against the bridge of my nose. "Vanessa, you don't understand. Grace is... she's not doing well. The doctors said she might not make it past the middle of the month." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a long, theatrical sigh. It was a sound I knew well. The sound of my sister being deeply inconvenienced by someone else's tragedy. "Come on, Milan, don't be so dramatic," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Everyone has their own problems. You can't expect the world to stop for you." And there it was. The final blow. My daughter's life wasn't a tragedy. It was a drama. My pain wasn't real. It was a problem, an inconvenient entry on our social calendar. I didn't say another word. I just pressed the red icon on my screen, ending the call. I walked back into the room and stood over Grace. There were no tears. The anger was too immense, too cold. It wasn't a fire, it was a glacier forming inside my chest, freezing everything in its path. I sat down, took her hand, and began to hum softly. It was an old lullaby. "Hush, little baby." As the quiet words filled the room, I thought about how my mother had never sung it to me. I couldn't remember her ever singing me to sleep. I looked at my daughter's peaceful face, and a question echoed in the new, cold silence of my heart. Has it always been this way? I picked up my phone one last time. My movements were calm, deliberate. I navigated to the settings, my training kicking in. I wasn't a grieving mother anymore. I was a soldier securing my position. I switched the phone to silent, then activated Do Not Disturb. I was cutting communications. The outside world, the one with its housewarming parties and saltwater pools, no longer existed. My mission was clear. My only mission. I was here. And I would not leave my post until the very end. Sitting in the dim, sterile quiet of the hospital room, my phone now silent on the nightstand, the question I'd asked myself earlier returned. Has it always been this way? The cold anger from Vanessa's call had thawed into a familiar, heavy ache. It was a grief older than the one for my daughter. It was a grief for the little girl I used to be, the one who never stopped trying to earn her place. The memories weren't a flood. They were more like old battle scars, the kind that ache when the weather turns cold. And in the chilling atmosphere of that room, they began to throb. My mind drifted back to a sweltering day in June, years ago. I was 18, sitting in a folding chair on the high school football field, the polyester of my graduation gown sticking to my skin. I'd graduated with honors, the gold cord looped around my neck, feeling like the heaviest thing I'd ever worn. I scanned the sea of faces in the bleachers, my heart pounding with a desperate, hopeful rhythm. I'd told them where I'd be sitting, third row from the aisle. The ceremony dragged on. Name after name was called. The sun beat down. My parents' seats remained empty. A hollow feeling started to grow in my stomach. Then, just as the valedictorian was finishing his speech, I saw them. My father, Harold, looking at his watch, and my mother, Janet, fanning herself with the program. They hadn't even made it for my name. They found me afterward as families were swarming the field with flowers and balloons. My mother didn't hug me, she just patted my arm, her eyes already scanning for the exit. Let's go, Milan, she said, her voice tight. Vanessa's waiting in the car. She can't stand the heat, it gives her a headache. And just like that, it was over. My 4 years of hard work, of late-night studying, of earning that gold cord, were all dismissed for my sister's headache. We never even took a picture. The celebratory dinner my friends' families were having was out of the question. We went to a generic chain restaurant where the entire meal was dedicated to soothing Vanessa, who had just had a minor fight with her boyfriend. My diploma sat on the table between the salt shaker and a basket of bread rolls, a silent testament to an achievement no one in my family cared to witness. I had become invisible. Another memory surfaced, sharper this time. Christmas morning, the year I turned 19. I was home on leave from basic training, my body lean and hard, my hair shorn into a practical buzz cut my mother hated. I felt proud, strong, like I was finally becoming someone. I had saved every penny from my meager army paycheck to buy my mother the one thing she'd been talking about for months: a soft, dove-gray cashmere scarf she'd seen in a Nordstrom catalog. I watched her face as she opened the box. Her smile was thin, polite. "Oh, that's nice, dear," she said, the words barely registering. She draped it over the back of a chair and immediately turned her attention to the next gift. A moment later, Vanessa, who was 21 and working as an intern, handed our mother a beautifully wrapped box. Inside was a high-end anti-aging skincare set from La Mer. My mother gasped, her eyes lighting up in a way I'd never seen for me. She threw her arms around Vanessa, holding the box like it was a sacred artifact. "Oh, Nessa, you shouldn't have. Look, Harold, isn't she the most thoughtful daughter?" All evening, she paraded the expensive creams around for visiting relatives to admire. My cashmere scarf, the one that represented weeks of push-ups in the mud and waking before dawn, was eventually buried under a mountain of discarded wrapping paper. The message was clear. My sacrifice was worthless compared to my sister's credit card. Even the current nightmare with Grace wasn't new. It was just a more brutal version of the same old story. I remembered the first time I called them from the hospital, my voice cracking as I tried to explain the doctor's initial diagnosis. I needed my mother. I needed her to tell me it would be okay. Instead, what I got was a progress report on Vanessa. "Oh, Milan, that's just awful," my mother had said, a beat of genuine shock in her voice before it shifted. "You know, Vanessa's been under so much stress too. Her project at the pharmaceutical company is in its final phase, and the pressure is immense." The conversation had pivoted so fast it gave me whiplash. My daughter's potential cancer was just the opening act for the main event: my sister's career anxiety. I'd hung up the phone feeling more alone than ever, my grief not just unheard, but treated as an interruption. These memories weren't just isolated incidents, they were waypoints on a map, and they all led to the same destination: the U.S. Army Recruiting Office. Joining up wasn't just about patriotism, though I felt that too. It was an escape. It was a desperate act of self-preservation. In the Army, your worth wasn't determined by who your sister was or how much your gifts cost. It was earned. It was measured in your skill, your discipline, your loyalty to the person standing next to you. Rank wasn't given, it was achieved. For the first time in my life, I was part of a unit where I wasn't the expendable member. I had found a family that valued me for what I could do, not for how well I stayed out of the spotlight. My high school history teacher, Mr. Davies, once told me something that stuck with me. "Your greatest asset, Milan," he'd said, "isn't what others give you. It's what no one can ever take away from you." I didn't understand it then, but I did now. My resilience, my strength, they hadn't given me that. I had built it myself, in spite of them. And now, here I was. The ultimate test. My training had prepared me for enemies on foreign soil, for threats I could identify and neutralize. It had taught me how to fight. But this was a different kind of war. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've ever had your pain or your achievements dismissed, hit that like button to show some support. And in the comments, just type, "I see you." Because sometimes that's all we ever needed to hear. The Army taught me how to fight enemies I could see. But how do you fight an enemy that's supposed to be your family? When the biggest war of your life isn't on a battlefield, how are you supposed to fight? The end didn't come with the cacophony of alarms I had always dreaded. It arrived in the sacred quiet of dawn on June 9th. The relentless beeping of the heart monitor, the soundtrack to my life for months, suddenly flatlined. In the profound silence that followed, there was no chaos, only a heavy, crushing peace. Grace's eyes opened one last time. They weren't focused on me, but somewhere beyond, as if she saw a light I couldn't. Her chest gave one final tiny rise. A whisper, so faint I almost missed it, escaped her lips. "I love you, Mommy." And then, she was still. The hand in mine, which had been so warm, began to cool. The silence in the room was absolute, a vacuum that sucked all the air, all the life, out of my world. My universe didn't collapse with a big bang. It simply disintegrated into dust. For a moment, I was nothing but a statue carved from ice. Sergeant Aguirre, U.S. Army, trained to remain calm under fire, to control every impulse. But the soldier in me was gone. My discipline, my training, every wall I had ever built, shattered into a million pieces. A sound ripped from my throat, a raw, primal scream that came from the deepest part of my soul. It was the sound of a mother breaking. It was an animal cry of pure, undiluted agony. I clung to her small, lifeless body, refusing to let go, my sobs shaking the sterile hospital bed. Nurses rushed in, their voices gentle but firm, trying to pull me away. "Sergeant Aguirre, Milan, we need to." But their words were just noise. Letting go of her felt like being dragged from my final fighting position, abandoning my post. I had failed my only mission, to protect her. Hours later, after the pitying looks and the paperwork were done, I found myself sitting in the sterile quiet of the hospital's family room. A styrofoam cup of coffee growing cold in my hands. The shock had subsided, replaced by a chilling, operational calm. I had a new task now, to inform the next of kin. I called my parents. My voice was flat, devoid of emotion, like a soldier delivering a casualty report. "Grace passed away this morning," I said, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. "She's gone." There was a sharp intake of breath on my mother's end. "Oh, Milan. Oh, God." "The funeral will be on the 15th of June, I continued, my tone procedural. A long silence stretched over the line. I could hear the gears turning in her head. "The 15th?" she repeated, her voice suddenly strained. Oh, dear God. For a fleeting, foolish second, I thought she understood. I thought the horror of the coincidence had dawned on her. Let me talk to your father and Vanessa," she stammered. We'll figure it out." I hung up, clinging to that thin, fragile sliver of hope. "They'll figure it out." The words echoed in my mind. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that my rear guard, my family, would finally assemble. That in the face of this ultimate tragedy, they would show up. It was a stupid hope, the kind you have when you're desperate. That night, my phone rang. It was Vanessa. Her voice was coated in a thin layer of practiced sympathy. "Milan, I am so sorry to hear about Grace. It's just terrible." It was a line she'd probably rehearsed. It lasted all of 5 seconds before she got to the real point of the call. "Listen," she said, her voice shifting to the brisk, efficient tone she used for business. "About the 15th, I just can't move the party. I have over 100 guests confirmed, the caterers, the band. It's all set in stone. The deposits are non-refundable. Could you, maybe, move the funeral?" The world tilted on its axis. I was sure I had misheard her. "Move it?" I whispered, my throat tightening. "Yeah," she said, completely oblivious to the monstrousness of her own words. "I mean, from a logistical standpoint, it's much more flexible, right? You could hold her at the funeral home for a few more days. It might even be good for you, give you some extra time to, pull yourself together." The suggestion was so vile, so grotesquely obscene, that I couldn't form a response. The image she'd just planted in my head, my daughter's body being stored in a refrigerated drawer like a piece of meat. Also, my sister could serve champagne and hors d'oeuvres to her pharma company friends, was an indignity beyond comprehension. It was a desecration. The next morning, my father called. His voice was heavy with a forced, awkward sincerity. Milan, we talked it over, he began, clearing his throat. And, well, Vanessa has a point. I said nothing, the ice in my veins spreading. He started rambling, his words a pathetic attempt to justify the unjustifiable. He talked about the non-refundable plane tickets from Phoenix to Arizona, about not wanting to disappoint Vanessa after all her hard work, about the importance of celebrating life. Grace would have wanted us to celebrate life, honey, he said, his voice thick with false sentiment. That's when the ice broke. How would you know what Grace would have wanted? I shot back, my voice dangerously quiet. You visited your granddaughter exactly one time. You spent 10 minutes with her before you said you had to get back to your hotel to check on a golf reservation. He stammered, caught off guard. Now, Milan, you're being emotional. Emotional? The word was a laugh without humor. My daughter is dead, and you're worried about upsetting Vanessa. You're choosing a party over your own granddaughter's funeral. He finally dropped the pretense. His voice became stern, the voice of a father who was tired of his difficult daughter's drama. We are going to the party, Milan. Vanessa really needs us right now. Vanessa needs us. The words hung in the air, a final verdict. In the triage of family priorities, my dying daughter had been a low-priority casualty. My grief was an inconvenience, but my sister's social climbing, that was a crisis that required immediate support. I felt the last thread connecting me to them snap. It made no sound, there was no pain. There was only a cold, clean certainty. I had learned a vital lesson in the army. You never abandon your comrades. My family had just willingly left me and my fallen child behind on the battlefield. My voice, when I finally spoke, was calm. It was the voice of a commander giving a final, irrevocable order. There was no anger left, only the chilling emptiness of a decision made. Then don't come to the funeral, I said. Have a good time. I ended the call before he could respond. The connection was severed, in every sense of the word. June 15th arrived, not with the blistering heat of Phoenix, but with the soft, gray light of a Virginia morning. Grace's funeral was held in a small historic chapel near Fort Belvoir, its stone walls cool and quiet. The air inside was thick with the scent of lilies and old wood, a solemnity that felt like a weighted blanket over the chaos raging inside me. The pews were mostly empty. There were no aunts, no uncles, no grandparents. My blood relatives, my family of origin, were not there. Their absence was a gaping wound, a void that should have swallowed me whole. But it didn't, because Sergeant Julia Reyes was there. She sat beside me, a solid, unwavering presence. A few rows back, a handful of other soldiers from my unit sat ramrod straight, their dress uniforms immaculate. Even my ex-husband, Mark, Grace's father, had flown in from his new post in Germany. We weren't a couple anymore, but today we were parents, united in our loss. And there was an honor guard, a small detail of young soldiers from the U.S. Army, their faces somber and professional. They moved with a quiet precision that was, in itself, a profound gesture of respect. They weren't here because they had to be. They were here because I was one of them, and my daughter's passing was a loss to the entire military family. I stood frozen as the chaplain spoke of angels and heaven, his words a gentle drone that I barely heard. A chill crept over me, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature in the chapel. Julia must have noticed me shiver. Without a word, she slipped off her own uniform jacket and gently draped it over my shoulders. "You're cold," she whispered. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact, an observation of a need she intended to meet. It was the kind of simple, profound care I'd craved from my own mother my entire life. After the service, as we stood outside under the overcast sky, people offered their condolences. Their words were kind but felt hollow, like polite formalities. Julia didn't offer platitudes. She didn't say she's in a better place or time heals all wounds. Instead, she pressed a warm paper cup into my hands. It was black coffee, just the way I liked it. Then she handed me a foil-wrapped turkey sandwich from the small reception inside. "You need to eat," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. It was a direct order, given with more love than any flowery sympathy card could ever convey. That small practical act of nourishment meant more to me than 1,000 empty prayers. It meant, I am here, I am watching over you, I will not let you fall. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the lectern at the front of the chapel. I placed my hands on either side of the wooden stand to steady myself, my back as straight as I could make it. I looked out, not at the empty spaces where my parents and sister should have been, but at the faces of the people who had shown up. At Julia's steady gaze, at the respectful faces of the young soldiers. My voice, when it came, was firm. There were no tears, no trembling. I didn't speak of my own grief, of the gaping hole in my life. I knew they already understood that. Instead, I spoke about Grace. My daughter, Grace, was a warrior, I began. She fought a battle none of us could win, but she fought it with more courage than I've seen on any battlefield. She faced every needle, every treatment, every setback with a spirit that refused to be broken. I told them about her smile, a smile so bright it could have lit up a forward operating base in the dead of night. I talked about her love for Sergeant Fluffy and her dream of having a bouncy castle at her 4th birthday party. I painted a picture of a little girl who was not a victim, but a hero in her own right. I never mentioned the deserters. I never spoke the names of the family who had abandoned their post. But as I looked at my comrades, my brothers and sisters in arms, I made a silent vow. This is my family now. The people who show up, the people who stand their ground, and I would defend my daughter's memory from the disgrace my other family had cast upon it. The service concluded at the graveside. The honor guard performed their duty with solemn grace. As the bugler played taps, the mournful notes hung in the humid air, each one a tribute to a life cut short. 2 soldiers lifted the American flag that had draped Grace's small white casket. They folded it with meticulous, practiced movements, each of the 13 folds sharp and precise, until it formed a tight, blue triangle of stars. One of the young soldiers, his face barely old enough to shave, stepped forward. He knelt before me, presenting the folded flag. "On behalf of the President of the United States," he said, his voice clear and unwavering, "and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your daughter's service." He corrected himself slightly, his professionalism softening for a moment. "For your family's service." I took the flag, its weight heavy and real in my hands. I clutched it to my chest, the coarse fabric a tangible link to the honor and dignity of the moment. And in that instant, a split-screen image flashed in my mind, as clear and vivid as any intelligence report. Here, in Virginia, I stood in the dignified silence of a military funeral, holding the symbol of my country. And there, 2,000 miles away in Phoenix, Arizona, my parents and sister were standing in the brilliant sunshine. I could see them perfectly. Laughing, clinking champagne glasses, celebrating a house built on foundations of greed and narcissism. The contrast didn't break me, it forged me. The image of their smiling faces wasn't a source of pain anymore. It was a target acquisition. The grief was still there, a vast, black ocean inside me. But now, it had a direction. My mission objective, once clouded by sorrow, was now crystal clear. The days following the funeral were a blur of suffocating quiet. I returned to my small, empty apartment off base, a space that was once filled with Grace's laughter and the clatter of her toys. The silence now was a physical presence, a weight that threatened to crush me. Grief is a disorienting fog, and it would have been easy to get lost in it, to surrender to the overwhelming pain. But I am a soldier, and soldiers are not trained to surrender. I didn't allow myself to collapse. Instead, I channeled the discipline that had been drilled into me at Fort Jackson. On the 3rd day, I sat at my kitchen table, the folded American flag from Grace's casket sitting in the center like a silent commander. I opened my laptop, the screen's bright light cutting through the gloom. I bypassed the folders of photos, the memories that would only weaken my resolve. I opened a new Word document. At the top of the blank page, I typed a title. It wasn't a journal entry. It was the name of a mission. Operation Judgment Day. My grief was no longer a chaotic storm of emotion. It was now data. It was quantifiable. I began to outline the mission parameters, my fingers moving across the keyboard with cold precision. Targets: 1. Vanessa Aguirre, primary. 2. Harold Aguirre, secondary. 3. Janet Aguirre, secondary. Assets: 1. Vanessa, career, reputation, financial status. 2. Harold and Janet, social standing, financial security, peace of mind. Phases of execution: 1. Reconnaissance and de-escalation gathering. 2. Target neutralization, primary. 3. Psychological operations, secondary targets. I was no longer a grieving mother. I was an intelligence officer planning a campaign. My pain was the fuel, but strategy would be my weapon. Phase 1 began immediately. My first theater of operations, social media. It was the modern battlefield of reputation, and my family had provided me with an arsenal of ammunition. I navigated to Vanessa's Instagram page. Her profile was a curated monument to her own success, and the housewarming party was her coronation. I scrolled through the photos, my face impassive. There they were. My father, beaming, his arm around Vanessa. My mother, looking adoringly at her golden child. Guests laughing, holding glasses of wine, posing by the new saltwater pool. It was a portrait of a happy, successful American family, a complete fabrication. One photo stopped me cold. It was my mother, Janet, hugging Vanessa. Both of them were smiling, radiant with joy. The caption, written by my sister, read, "So proud of my successful daughter. A perfect day with the people who matter most." I checked the timestamp. It was posted at 2:15 p.m. Eastern Time on June 15th. The exact moment I had been standing at a lectern, delivering my daughter's eulogy. I took a screenshot. Click. Another piece of evidence logged. I found a video clip, a snippet from someone's story. Vanessa was holding a glass of champagne, laughing. "Finally, a fun day with no drama to bring us down," she said to the camera. No drama. That's what my daughter's death was to her. An inconvenient drama. Click. Saved. One picture, posted by a family friend, was the most damning of all. It was a group shot of my parents and Vanessa standing under a large banner that read, "Celebrating the Good Life." The caption underneath it, "Family over everything." The hypocrisy was so profound it was almost breathtaking. Each photo, each caption, wasn't just a betrayal. It was a bullet. And I was collecting every single one. Just as I was closing the browser, my phone rang. The screen displayed my mother's name. For a half second, a flicker of the old hope returned. Maybe she's calling to apologize. Maybe it's finally sunk in. I was a fool. "Milan," she said, her voice laced with a familiar, self-righteous indignation. "Your father and I have been waiting for your call." "Why would I call?" I asked, my voice flat. "To apologize, of course," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "You didn't come to your sister's party. You deeply hurt her feelings, Milan. After all her hard work, you need to learn to forgive and move on." A dry, mirthless laugh escaped my lips. "Forgive? Are you seriously talking to me about forgiveness?" "There you go again," she snapped, her voice rising. "You've always been so resentful. Vanessa has worked so hard for everything she has, and you tried to ruin her big day with your negativity." That was it. The final confirmation. There was no remorse, no guilt. In their version of reality, I was the villain. My grief was a weapon I had used to attack them. My daughter's funeral was an inconvenience I'd selfishly scheduled to overshadow my sister's triumph. This wasn't a mistake. This was who they were. "Thank you, Mom," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You've made things very clear." I hung up before she could say another word. The last bridge was burned. I was free. Now I could operate without hesitation. I turned my attention back to the primary target, Vanessa. Her weakness wasn't her vanity or her narcissism, those were just symptoms. Her true vulnerability was her career at Healthwise Pharmaceuticals. I knew my sister. She had always been a master of cutting corners, of achieving success by any means necessary. Her perfect life had to have cracks in its foundation. I just needed to find them. I spent the rest of the night conducting OSINT, open source intelligence. It was a skill the Army had taught me well: how to mine the vast public archives of the internet for actionable intel. I cross-referenced medical journals, news articles, and obscure online forums for any mention of Healthwise or its top-selling products. For hours, I found nothing but corporate press releases and glowing reviews. Then, deep in the search results, on page 14, I found it. A small article from a local newspaper in Ohio. The headline was unassuming: "Local physician's license suspended by state medical board." I clicked the link. The article detailed the case of a Dr. Alan Pierce whose license had been permanently revoked. The reason? Gross negligence and unethical conduct for massively overprescribing a powerful, highly addictive opioid painkiller. My heart began to beat faster. I scanned the article for the name of the drug, and there it was: Oxyvera, a flagship product of Healthwise Pharmaceuticals, the very drug whose marketing campaign had won Vanessa her last promotion. It wasn't just a crack in the foundation, it was a fault line, and I had just found my way in. One of my former commanding officers had a saying he drilled into every soldier under his command: never fight a fair fight. You make sure you have every advantage on your side before the first shot is ever fired. That principle became the cornerstone of Operation Judgment Day. My first lead, the disgraced Dr. Pierce in Ohio, was a start, but I needed to get inside Healthwise. My OSINT search eventually led me to a LinkedIn profile of a former compliance officer at the company, a woman named Sarah Jenkins. Her profile indicated she'd left Healthwise abruptly 6 months ago. A little more digging through public records revealed she had filed a wrongful termination suit that was quickly settled out of court and sealed. A classic whistleblower case. She was my way in. I couldn't approach her as Milan Aguirre, the grieving sister. That would be messy, emotional. I needed to be surgical. I created a new identity. Dr. Eleanor Vance, an independent research consultant working on a paper about ethical practices in the pharmaceutical industry. I registered a domain name, built a simple but professional website, and created a corresponding email address. My first email to Sarah Jenkins was carefully crafted. I used industry-specific terminology I'd spent days researching. I mentioned my analysis of recent FDA warning letters and my interest in corporate compliance protocols. I also attached the public news article about Dr. Pierce, framing it as a case study. I showed her I had done my homework. I wasn't a threat, I was a professional. She was wary at first, but after a few email exchanges where I demonstrated my knowledge, she agreed to a video call. Over a secure line, she told me her story. She had tried to raise internal alarms about the aggressive, off-label marketing of Oxyvera. She had compiled reports showing a direct correlation between sales bonuses and spikes in prescriptions in certain territories. For her efforts, she was branded a troublemaker and fired. Her settlement came with a strict non-disclosure agreement. "They buried it, Dr. Vance," she said, her voice bitter. "They buried all of it." "Help me unbury it," I replied, my tone calm and academic. Something in my professional demeanor must have earned her trust. The next day, a password-protected file appeared in my inbox. It contained a treasure trove of internal documents, email chains, sales reports, and redacted internal memos. It was the key to the entire operation. For the next 2 weeks, my apartment became a command center. I worked with the focus of an intelligence analyst piecing together enemy communications. I pinned sales charts to my wall, connecting them with red yarn to a map of the United States, marking the territories of doctors who had been disciplined for overprescribing. The pattern was undeniable. Vanessa was at the center of it all. Her emails were brazen, encouraging her sales team to push Oxyvera for everything from chronic back pain to post-operative recovery, despite the drug only being approved for severe, end-of-life cancer pain. She had designed a bonus structure that directly rewarded the highest prescribers. It wasn't just unethical, it was a criminal conspiracy that traded lives for profit. One document hit me like a physical blow. It was an internal complaint from the family of a patient who had died from an oxyvera overdose. The patient was a 40-year-old woman who had been prescribed the drug for fibromyalgia. At the bottom of the form was a section for dependents. It listed a single name, a 4-year-old daughter. This was no longer just about my family's betrayal. It was about justice. The dossier I compiled was an airtight indictment. Every claim was supported by a corresponding email, a payment record, or a sales report. It was irrefutable. My next step was to find the right delivery system for this warhead. I found him in Washington, D.C., Trevor Hayes, an investigative journalist for a major national newspaper, a Pulitzer finalist with a reputation for taking down corporate giants. We met at a quiet coffee shop in Georgetown, a place with dark wood and low lighting, perfect for a confidential exchange. Trevor was sharp, his eyes missing nothing. I didn't give him a sob story. I didn't mention Grace. I simply slid a black USB drive across the table. "My name is Eleanor Vance," I said, using my cover. "Inside this drive is everything you need to expose a criminal conspiracy at Healthwise Pharmaceuticals, orchestrated by one of their product directors, Vanessa Aguirre. My source is unimpeachable." He picked up the drive, turning it over in his fingers. "A lot of people make claims like that, Dr. Vance. Why should I believe you? What's your motive in this?" I met his gaze, and for the first time, I let the mask slip. The cold, raw truth came out. "She threw a party on the day of my daughter's funeral," I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy whisper. "This is my eulogy for her career." The shock on his face told me I had him. He just nodded slowly and pocketed the drive. Exactly 2 weeks later, the bomb went off. The story was on the front page, above the fold. The Healthwise Scandal: How Profits Were Prioritized Over Patients' Lives. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The article went viral, a firestorm that consumed cable news and social media. Healthwise's stock plummeted 30% by noon. The FDA and the Department of Justice both announced formal investigations by the end of the day. Vanessa was suspended, pending an internal review. 3 days later, she was fired. Her perfect, curated life had been demolished in a single news cycle. That evening, I received a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was one sentence: "You are a monster." I read the message from my sister. I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no regret. Just the quiet calm of a mission objective completed. I deleted the text. Then I opened the Operation Judgment Day file on my laptop. I marked the entry for Vanessa Aguirre with a single word: neutralized. My cursor moved down to the next line. Phase 2. Psychological operations. The primary target was down. Now it was time to deal with her collaborators. With Vanessa's career neutralized, my focus shifted. My secondary targets, my parents, required a different strategy. Their assets weren't contained in a corporate office. They were woven into the very fabric of their comfortable suburban Phoenix life. They hadn't committed a crime the DOJ could prosecute, but their sin was just as profound. In military strategy, we have SESWIOPs, psychological operations, designed to disrupt an enemy's morale and decision-making capabilities. My objective was not to destroy their lives, but to dismantle the two pillars they valued above all else: their finances and their precious social reputation. I'd spent years listening to my mother worry endlessly about what the neighbors would think. "What will people say?" was the unspoken creed of the Aguirre household. Their self-worth was a reflection in the eyes of their friends at the country club and the congregation at their church. I wasn't going to tell the world what to think. I was simply going to show them the truth and let them draw their own conclusions. But first, I needed a diversion. My father, Harold, was arrogant about his self-taught investment skills, but technologically inept. He used the same simple password for everything: Vanessa's birthday, and was notoriously susceptible to online scams. This was his critical vulnerability. I spent an evening designing a phishing email. It was a work of art, a perfect replica of an official communication from the IRS, complete with the correct logos and bureaucratic language. The subject line read, "Urgent, Notice of Federal Tax Audit." The email informed him that his investment portfolio had been flagged for significant irregularities and that a full audit was imminent. I sent it at 8:01 a.m. on a Monday morning. The bait was set. While my father was undoubtedly panicking, calling his accountant and scrambling through his financial records, I initiated the main assault. My parents were distracted, their attention diverted by the financial threat. Now was the time to strike at their reputation. I compiled a small anonymous package. Inside, I placed a selection of the most polished professional photographs from Vanessa's housewarming party, the ones that screamed, "Perfect family." I printed Grace's obituary from the local Virginia newspaper website. I also included a pristine copy of the program from her funeral service, with the date, June 15th, clearly visible. I put these 3 items in a manila envelope with a single typewritten note. It contained only 12 words. The party was held on the same day as their granddaughter's funeral. I mailed the package to a popular local blogger in Phoenix, a woman whose website, The Phoenix Files, specialized in social commentary and the hidden dramas of the city's affluent neighborhoods. I sent it with no return address, dropped in a public mailbox miles from my apartment. 2 days later, the story broke. The blogger didn't need to add much commentary. The documents spoke for themselves. She posted the pictures from the party side by side with a scan of the funeral program. The headline was simple and devastating. A celebration of life or a celebration of indifference. The Aguirre family's unthinkable choice. The story exploded across the local Phoenix social media scene. It was shared on community Facebook groups, on Nextdoor, and was picked up by a local news affiliate. The narrative was irresistible, a story of breathtaking callousness hidden behind the facade of suburban success. The consequences were swift and brutal. My parents' carefully constructed world began to crumble. Friends of 30 years suddenly stopped answering their calls. My mother was quietly asked to step down from the church fundraising committee she had chaired for a decade. The pastor, they said, felt it would be for the best, given the circumstances. The most satisfying blow came a week later. My father, who prided himself on his position on the board of their exclusive golf club, received a call. There had been complaints, a lot of them. His presence was becoming a distraction. He was formally asked to resign. My punishment wasn't a prison sentence or a lawsuit. It was social isolation. It was the quiet shunning of an entire community. I had turned their greatest fear, "What will people say?" into their reality. They weren't being judged by me. They were being judged by the very people whose approval they had spent a lifetime courting. I simply provided the evidence. They had already passed sentence on themselves. Predictably, my mother called. The self-righteous anger was gone, replaced by a desperate, tearful panic. "Milan, what are you doing to us?" she sobbed into the phone. "You're destroying this family. Everyone is looking at us like we're monsters." I leaned back in my chair, the silence of my apartment a stark contrast to her hysteria. My voice when I answered was calm and measured. "I'm not doing anything," I said, ping. "I'm just holding up a mirror. I'm showing the world the truth of what you did." "But it wasn't like that. We were supporting Vanessa," she cried, her voice escalating. "We had to be there for her." "You had to be there for her," I repeated, the words tasting like ash. "But you didn't have to be there for me. You didn't have to be there for Grace. That was a choice." I let the silence hang in the air for a moment, letting the weight of her own words crush her. "You stood there," I said, my voice dropping to an icy calm, "smiling for pictures while your granddaughter was being lowered into the ground. These are the consequences of that choice." I hung up the phone before she could reply. Phase 2 was complete. The enemy's morale was broken. Their fortress of social respectability had been reduced to rubble. Months later, I found myself in a different kind of theater of war, a federal courtroom in Washington, D.C. The air was heavy with the scent of floor polish and nervous tension. This was the final stage, the public reckoning for what Vanessa had done. I wasn't there as a witness or a victim. I was there as an observer. I chose my attire with care. Not a somber black dress, but my full Army service uniform, the dress blues. The green fabric was perfectly pressed, the brass buttons gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and my commendation ribbons were aligned with geometric precision. I sat alone in the last row of the gallery, my back straight, my hands resting on my knees. I was not Milan Aguirre, the broken-hearted sister. I was Sergeant Aguirre, U.S. Army, present to witness the conclusion of a successful operation. From my vantage point, I conducted a silent battle damage assessment. I saw my parents in the front row. They looked diminished. My father's expensive suit seemed to hang off his frame, and my mother's face was a mask of strained misery. They looked older, beaten down by the public shame and the staggering legal fees. They were collateral damage in a war they had helped start. Then I saw my sister. Vanessa was led in, not in one of her designer power suits, but in a drab, ill-fitting orange jumpsuit. Her blonde hair was limp, her face pale, and stripped of its usual confident makeup. She looked small, desperate, and utterly defeated. Our eyes met for a fleeting second across the courtroom. I felt nothing. No pity, no triumph. Just a cold, final sense of detachment. The prosecution laid out its case with ruthless efficiency, using the very documents I had provided to Trevor Hayes. The email chains, the sales reports, the bonus structures. It was an open and shut case of corporate greed leading to multiple deaths. The climax of the trial came when Vanessa took the stand. This was her last stand, her final desperate attempt to win the sympathy of the jury. Her lawyer guided her through a carefully rehearsed performance. She wept. She spoke of the immense pressure to succeed, of the cutthroat corporate culture at Healthwise. And then, she turned her sights on me. My sister. Milan, she began, her voice choked with fabricated sobs. She's a military hero. She's always been the strong one, the perfect one. I've spent my whole life living in her shadow. She looked towards the jury, her eyes pleading. I always felt like I had to do more, to be more, just to get my parents' attention. Her coldness, her distance. She was never there for me. If she had just been a sister to me, maybe I wouldn't have made such terrible mistakes. It was a masterful, disgusting piece of theater. She was attempting to reframe her criminal negligence as a cry for help, blaming me, the sister whose child's funeral she had skipped for a party, for her actions. A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. For a moment, I saw a flicker of doubt in a juror's eyes. The prosecutor, a sharp, no-nonsense man named Mr. Chen, let her finish. He didn't cross-examine her on her ludicrous claims. He didn't even look at her. Instead, he turned to the gallery. The prosecution calls Mr. David Miller to the stand. A gray-haired man in a worn-out flannel shirt made his way to the witness box. His hands trembled as he was sworn in. He was the father of the 4-year-old girl I had read about in the internal complaint, the little girl left without a mother because of oxyvira. Mr. Miller, the prosecutor said gently, can you please tell the court about your daughter, Emily? His voice cracked as he spoke. He didn't talk about the drug or the lawsuit. He talked about his little girl. He talked about how she loved finger painting and watching cartoons on Saturday mornings. He described her dream of becoming a veterinarian because she wanted to help all the puppies. He painted a picture of a life full of promise, a future that had been stolen. Then he turned his head and looked directly at Vanessa. The courtroom was utterly silent. My little girl asks me every night when Mommy is coming home from heaven, he said, his voice raw with a grief I knew all too well. Your greed took her mother away. Your greed did that. His simple, heartbreaking testimony did what hours of legal argument could not. It vaporized Vanessa's web of lies. It exposed her self-pity for the obscene narcissism it was. Her calculated performance crumbled into nothing. She sat there, exposed and pathetic, with nothing left to hide behind. The jury was out for less than 2 hours. The verdict was guilty on all counts. When the judge handed down the sentence, 15 years in a federal prison and millions in restitution, a gasp went through the courtroom. My parents slumped in their seats, broken. Vanessa just stared blankly, as if she couldn't comprehend it. I did not smile. I did not cry. I simply gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Mission complete. I stood up before anyone could turn to look at me, my duty here done. I walked out of the courtroom, my footsteps echoing in the silent hall. As I pushed open the heavy doors and stepped out into the bright, indifferent sunshine, I didn't feel the relief of victory. I didn't feel the sweet taste of revenge. I felt only the vast, deafening silence of a battlefield after the fighting is over. The war was won, but the cost had been immeasurable. Justice for one person can sometimes be justice for many. If you believe that accountability is one of the most important things in this world, hit the like button. In the comments, just write the word accountability to show you stand for it. Operation Judgment Day was officially over. All targets had been neutralized. All objectives had been met. The war was won. But there was no victory parade. There was only silence. My apartment, which had been a bustling command center for months, was now just an empty space. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was echoing. The mission had given me purpose, a target for my rage and my grief. It had allowed me to channel the chaos into a structured, actionable plan. Now, with no more enemies to track and no more strategies to devise, I was left with the one thing I had been running from: the raw, unvarnished truth of my loss. I was alone with the ghost of my daughter. Revenge, I discovered, isn't a cure. It's not even a medicine. It's a battlefield anesthetic, a powerful drug that numbs the pain just long enough for you to keep fighting. But eventually, the drug wears off. And when it does, the wound is still there, just as deep and agonizing as before. The anger had been a shield, and now it was gone, leaving me completely exposed. A few weeks after Vanessa's sentencing, my phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice was thin and panicked, stripped of all its former authority. "Milan, it's your father," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "He's had a heart attack. He's at St. Joseph's Hospital." I listened, my own heart a steady, silent drum in my chest. I felt nothing. No panic, no concern, not even a flicker of the old conditioned sense of duty. "You have to come," she pleaded, her voice breaking into a sob. "He needs you. Please, Milan." I took a slow, deep breath. My response was not born of anger, but of a chilling clarity. "Is he dying?" I asked, my voice as flat and clinical as a doctor's report. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "What?" she finally stammered. "Is his condition life-threatening?" I pressed, my tone unchanging. "I need a situation update for my report." I was using the language of the military, a language she couldn't penetrate. It was a wall of protocol, and she was on the other side of it. "Milan, how can you talk like that?" she whispered, horrified. "You trained me to," I replied softly, and hung up the phone. 2 weeks later, they showed up. They must have driven all the way from Phoenix to Virginia. Since I wasn't answering their calls, they came directly to my last known address, Fort Belvoir. I was in my office reviewing supply logistics when the call came from the front gate. A military police officer informed me I had 2 civilian visitors, a herald and Janet Aguirre. I took a moment to compose myself, buttoning my uniform jacket and setting my service cap squarely on my head. When I walked out to the visitor control center, the scene was one I never could have imagined. They were standing on the civilian side of the security fence, looking lost and out of place. They looked old, tired, and utterly defeated. My father was leaning against the fence for support, his face pale and drawn. The heart attack, it seemed, had taken a real toll. They were outsiders, begging for entry into a world where I belonged. A world where I held the authority. The power dynamic of my entire life had been completely inverted. "Milan," my father began, his voice raspy and weak. He took a shuffling step forward. We are so sorry. For everything. Can't we just start over?" I looked at them. I didn't see my parents. The little girl inside me who had spent a lifetime craving their approval was finally, blessedly, silent. I saw 2 strangers who had made a series of choices. I was a soldier, and I was looking at 2 individuals who had deserted their post in the face of the enemy. No, I said. The word was quiet, but it was as solid and unmovable as the concrete barrier that separated us. My mother started to cry, the manipulative tears I knew so well. But we're family, Milan. Blood is thicker than water. You have to forgive us. The Aguirre family unit, I stated, my voice cutting through her sobs with the finality of a gavel strike, was officially disbanded on June 15th of last year. You deserted. She reached a hand through the chain-link fence, her fingers grasping at the air. Please, Milan. I raised my hand, not in anger, but as a gesture to halt. It was a simple, definitive motion. This is an order, I said, my voice leaving no room for negotiation. Do not contact me again. Do not come here again. The war is over. I held their gaze for one last moment, then I executed a perfect about-face and walked away. I did not look back. I left them there, on the other side of the fence, outside the gates of the life I had built for myself, the life I had defended. The war was over. I had won. But as I walked across the manicured lawns of the base, I had to face a new, more daunting mission. Figuring out how to live in the peace I had fought so hard to create. After the war comes the peace. And peace, I learned, can be its own kind of battlefield. The structure of my mission had been a refuge. The discipline and order of my work in the army provided a framework, a skeleton to hold me upright when I felt I would collapse. But Julia saw through the facade. She saw the hollow look in my eyes, the exhaustion that had nothing to do with long hours. One afternoon, she stopped by my desk and placed a simple, folded pamphlet in front of me. The logo was for TAPS, the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors. It's a real organization, a lifeline for military families grappling with loss. This isn't an order, Milan, she said softly, but maybe your next fight is in there. My first instinct was to refuse. I wasn't a victim, I was a soldier. I didn't need a support group. But later that night, I looked at the pamphlet again. I saw the faces of other families, other soldiers, their eyes holding a grief that I recognized. And for the first time, I considered the possibility that strength wasn't about standing alone. A week later, I walked into my first TAPS meeting. It was in a community room, with stale coffee and a circle of mismatched chairs. For the first time in over a year, I was in a room where I didn't have to be the strongest person. I didn't have to be Sergeant Aguirre. I could just be Milan. I listened as a young man spoke about losing his brother to an IED. A gray-haired woman talked about her husband, a Vietnam vet who had lost his battle with PTSD. A father spoke about his son, a pilot who never returned from a training exercise. They spoke of anger, of guilt, of the crushing loneliness. I didn't say a word. I just sat there and listened. And for the first time since Grace died, I cried. They weren't the wrenching, violent sobs of that first day. They were silent tears, flowing not from rage, but from a profound, heartbreaking empathy. In the shared language of loss, I realized I was not a lone operative. I was part of a different kind of unit now, the platoon of the survivors. Sometime during those quiet months, I picked up a book someone had recommended, Brené Brown's Daring Greatly. I read about the power of vulnerability. One line became my new creed. Vulnerability is not weakness, it's our greatest measure of courage. I had faced down enemies with weapons and strategy, but I was beginning to understand that allowing myself to be truly seen, to be vulnerable, was the bravest thing I could possibly do. A few months after that first meeting, I became a volunteer. TAPS paired me with a young woman named Sarah, the wife of a Marine who had been killed in Afghanistan 6 months prior. She was 24, overwhelmed, and trying to raise their 2-year-old son alone. I didn't offer her advice or tell her to be strong. I just showed up. I brought her a hot meal, a simple lasagna, the kind my own mother had never made for me. I played with her son on the floor so she could take a long, uninterrupted shower. I listened for hours as she talked, cried, and raged. I did for her the small, practical things that Julia had once done for me. I was passing on the supplies, reinforcing a fellow soldier on a different kind of front line. One evening, as I was getting ready to leave, she looked at me, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "How do you do it, Milan?" she asked. How are you so strong? I sat back down. And for the first time, I told someone the whole story. I told her about Grace, about her beautiful smile and her warrior spirit. And then I told her about Operation Judgment Day. I told her about the rage, the planning, and the cold satisfaction of justice. I don't regret fighting, I finished, my voice quiet but sure. I fought for my daughter's honor, and I would do it again. But I learned something at the end of it all. Demolition doesn't build anything new, it just clears the ground. I looked over at her son, who was sleeping peacefully in his crib. The rebuilding, it starts here. It starts by helping a comrade get back on her feet. The story ends on the 3rd anniversary of Grace's passing. I don't go to the cemetery. The granite headstone feels too cold, too final. Instead, I drive to the Marine Corps War Memorial before sunrise, the Iwo Jima Memorial. I stand there in the pre-dawn chill, looking up at the iconic bronze statue of the soldiers raising the flag. It's a monument not just to a single battle, but to the brutal, beautiful truth of survival. A victory born from unimaginable hardship and sacrifice. I don't pray. I just stand there as the first rays of sun begin to paint the Washington, D.C. sky in shades of pink and orange. I speak to Grace, not with my voice, but from my heart. I'm still fighting, my love, but I'm fighting for the light now. As the sun rises, casting a warm glow over the city, I don't feel happiness. Happiness feels too simple, too fleeting a word for the complex landscape of my heart. What I feel is peace. A quiet, hard-won peace. There is an ache for my daughter that will never go away, a scar that is now part of who I am. It doesn't weaken me. It reminds me of the depth of my love. The mission of revenge was over. The mission to live, and to live with purpose, had just begun. That's my story. It's a story about betrayal. But more than that, it's about rebuilding. I learned that true strength isn't about the wars we win against others, but about the peace we build within ourselves. My journey is far from over, but I'm no longer fighting alone. If my story resonated with you, if you've ever had to find your own light in the darkness, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories matter. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to the channel for more stories of survival and strength.